Hey, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Rick Marchine monthly method seminar. And please put your phones on mute. It is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Ron Hayes. Dr. Hayes is a distinguished professor of medicine, professor of health policy and management, and a RAND Corporation consultant. He serves as the director of the analysis core for Rick Marchine. He specializes in patient-reported measurement development and evaluation of measures of patient experience with healthcare and health-related quality of life. Dr. Ron Hayes is known for his skills in survey development. That's what everyone goes to him for. And so again, Dr. Hayes is a legend in surveys, and I'll just finish by saying you can't say Cronbach Alpha without saying Ron's name. So without further ado.
Hi. All right, thank you. So we're going to jump right into it. One thing, that link, why did I put there? It shouldn't be there, so you can ignore that. We'll erase that later. Is that coming back? Maybe
No, it isn't. No.
it's probably my one. Forget about that. Don't ever use it. Okay, so I'm going to use an example of analyzing survey data that's close to home. It's something that Jose Calderon, who was a pilot investigator from 2015 to 2016, had originated. So he looked at surveys from CAPS, the Consumer Assessment of Healthcare Providers and Systems project, and thought that they were a little bit difficult to complete. And he came up with an idea for simplifying the survey. And I've acknowledged his RICMAR, of course, the RICMAR project, but also I put in here some funding from CAPS that has allowed us finally to collect a little bit of data, not as much as I'd like, but just a tiny bit of data that I'm going to be analyzing today. And as many people know, Jose is no longer with us, unfortunately. So this is sort of dedicated to him and his brilliance at the time to come up with the idea. Unfortunately, it took forever to get anything tangible out of it, but at least we have something right now. So a little introduction about the ARC program. They funded CAP since 1995. So I've been a principal investigator through RAND on that. And there have been other places like Yale is now involved as well. So it's a collaborative group that works on developing and evaluating surveys. And the surveys have become very popular. They're used with CMS for high stake purposes, as noted here. They're used a lot for quality improvement. And they're also used a lot in research to advance the science of measurement of patient experience. All the surveys are really designed to reflect the patient's voice. So there's a lot of preliminary qualitative work that's done to get information about what's important to patients in different contexts where surveys are being developed, and then to try to run draft items by them and cognitive interviews to make sure they're understandable, and then to use them and field test and evaluate them and revise as needed over time. The should be idea probably. Okay, I can see it here. This is on the left. When we ended up doing a very small, which was going to be a bigger field test, but it ended up being a pretty small field test. But on the left is the standard CAPS clinician and group 3.1 survey cover page that we used. And on the right is what we're calling the easy survey that Jose Calderon primarily developed. And we revised it a little bit, but he had the main idea for it. So the cover page for what's on the right is supposed to be a little bit easier for people and more engaging than the one on the left. But the one on the left is more engaging than a lot of the CAPS covers are. So we actually did a little more, and this is what we're using in this project. But This is, before we go into the details of the field test that we did, this is to give you an idea of what actually Jose thought about doing in making the survey easier. So this is one example item from the clinician group CAPS 3.1 survey. And you can see that he made notations in about it. It has a passive lead-in in the last 6 months when you contacted this provider's office to get an appointment for care you needed right away. How often did you get an appointment as soon as you needed? So he points that out. He also points out the fact that there's random truncation of the item lines that are just based on spacing in Word, where you get to the end of the line and it'll just wrap around. So there's no logical sense to it. And when you look at the Flesch-Kincaid readability score, it's about 14th grade level. One of the features of CAP survey items is to try to say too much potentially, and there are some multiple syllable words and so on. So what he did as an example there is to simplify it to what you see below. Basically, how often did you get care as soon as you needed? And I'm not showing you some screener items and so forth, so you don't see the whole context, but this is the gist of what he did. And one of the things he tried to do is to put individual thoughts on one line. So he breaks them up so that you have one thought and then you go to another thought, and you have a lot fewer words. And in this case, the Flesch-Kincaid reading level was 3rd grade level. So he did that throughout the survey. So that's what we're comparing. We're going to compare the standard CAPS 3.1 questions with the easier version. And the survey is 31 questions in total. It has 9 questions that just get information like about age and gender and so on, 9 about you questions. So you have that kind of information. You also have some self-report health questions. And then the real meat of what we're after in the patient experience is reflected in this survey in one global rating question about the provider you saw. The survey actually asked about periodic over a long period of time, but you have to have seen a provider to be eligible to complete it. So global rating about that provider. And we have 4 multi-item scales that are getting at the real heart of it, and that's reporting about care. So a bunch of questions that ask about how often different things happen, and that's then aggregated into scales or multi-item scales. So I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but you can look later what the items are at the heart of them. Again, we don't have the item stems, but here's timely care. That scale is assessed by these 3 items. So in the last 6 months, different things, when you made an appointment for a checkup or routine care with this provider, how often do you get an appointment as soon as you needed, and so on. So that would also be known as access by some people. Then the next page, you see communication. There are 4 questions to get at that. How well the provider explains things, listens to you and shows respect for you and spends enough time with you. And then there are 3 items that are getting at coordination of care. How often does the provider seem to know important information about your medical history? And then when a test was ordered, how often do they follow up to give you test results and so on? And then there are 2 questions about the office staff courtesy and respect. So that's the gist of the CAPS clinician and group survey 3.1. The easy survey is parallel to that. So it's going after the same things. It's simpler wording of things, and there's some slight other differences that you can look at later. But the basic idea is it's a lot shorter and hopefully easier for people to read and respond to. So I don't have time to really spend on all the details here. One of the things that is very different is what I've highlighted here in coordination of care. Jose decided not just getting test results back to you, but actually explaining the test results to you. So that makes this this is one difference where that item becomes more like communication than it is just getting test results. So other than that, though, they're really pretty parallel. So the study that we finally ended up doing through RAND was in a safety net healthcare provider in Los Angeles. It was CHAP Care, but now they're being subsumed under Ultimed. So at the time they were CHAP Care, and they they agreed to do this randomization of the two surveys to patients who had seen a provider during the last 6 months. And the procedure that was used was a standard one in terms of trying to maximize the response rate, with a pre-notification letter, personalized letters and survey packets, first class postage, and sending a second survey to non-respondents. These were all mail surveys. We didn't do phone, not mixed mode. A lot of times we do, but the way this was set up, the easy survey is primarily dependent on mail administration. So that's all we did in this particular field test. And we did surveys in English and Spanish. The data collection ended in December 31st of last year, so a few months ago. And we ended up with 264 surveys returned in total. And 16 providers were actually, different providers were represented in those patient surveys. And it actually ended up being a mix of doctors, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants. So what I'm going to go through quickly to give an example of analyzing survey data is, just reporting the response rate, which wasn't great. We hoped to do a lot better than that, but didn't do very well. Failure to follow skip patterns, because the CAP surveys does have screener items. And, we want to know how often people have trouble with that and don't actually follow the instructions. How much missing data we had. Look at some item frequencies to compare the two surveys. Look at scale means and standard deviations for those 4 composites. Internal consistency, reliability of the composites, correlations among the composites and the global rating item. It says doctor level reliability here, but it's really provider level reliability, since we don't have only doctors. And a little bit about item scale correlations, which we refer to as multi-trait scaling, and then factor analyses. So the overall response rate was 18%. We were actually hoping to do a lot better than that. A lot of CAP surveys in this population are about 10%. So it's pretty poor response rate overall, but we hope to do a lot better than this, given the amount of effort that was being put into it, but we only got 18% overall. It turned out, surprisingly, that the standard survey actually got a higher response rate, 20%, versus the easy survey, 16%. So that's a little disappointing. We're going to see mixed results for the comparison of the two surveys. So in that case, we weren't happy with the fact that, we randomized equal number of people and we ended up with a higher response rate in the standard survey. It could be that people haven't really seen very much. All they've seen is the cover, and this is just the way it worked out. And in another study that may not happen, but that's not what we wanted to happen. We also had this thing where people were randomized to a $2 versus a $5 incentive, and response rate was not affected by that incentive. It probably wasn't enough of a difference, but we thought $5 might, yield a higher response rate. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. In the actual analytics sample, it's less than that 264, it's 232, because we had people who said that they had not seen the provider they were sampled for, or at least had not seen them in the last 6 months. So we lost some people that way and ended up with 133 in the standard survey and 99 in the easy survey. So that's what the analysis are based upon. The sample characteristics, just to give you an idea, is primarily female, Hispanic, a fair number of Black. Black is equal to white in terms of 14% of the respondents, and 7% Asian. 44% of the sample completed a Spanish language survey, so close to half. High school education or less was 33%, and you see the modal age category. And then you can see the distribution on health. You want to look at that later. Both physical health global rating and mental health global ratings are shown. And I don't show all the categories, just the top 3 categories, just for your information. Okay, so the first main result is the percent of the sample that failed to follow the skip pattern on these two surveys. So we had 8 different opportunities where there was a screener question and you could then skip if you gave a response that implied you should skip. So what I'm showing is people that should have skipped based on their answer to the screening question, what percent of them failed to skip. So Here we see column 2 is the standard clinician and group survey, and the third column is the easy survey. So the first skip opportunity, I have the ends. The ends are the number of people in total that should have skipped. So n equals 8 is on this, the first skip opportunity on the CG survey. There were 8 people who should have skipped. 12% of them did not. On the easy survey, there were 12 people who had an opportunity to skip. 33% did not skip appropriately. They continued to answer items that they were supposed to skip over. And if you look down this, you see that it looks like there probably is a little bit more problem with skipping with the easy survey than there was with the standard survey. There's an exception with the 7th time they had a chance where it was higher for the CG survey, but overall, it was more likely when there were these people who should have been skipping that it was occurring with the easy survey. So that was the second negative for the new survey, and we didn't expect. We expected the opposite, if anything. So there are two strikes against the easy survey at that point. Then we looked at item missing data rate. There were 24 items that are asked of everyone. There's some questions that you might skip over, like I was just referring to, but 24 questions are asked of everyone. You look at the mean missing item rate, it's actually not very big. It's about a half item for the standard survey and about 1 item for the easy survey. And that t-test of that difference is not significant, not quite significant, but it was a little less, not significantly less, but a little less missing data for the standard survey. We can just say, oh, they're pretty equivalent on that, and they were low. So that's not a strike against the easy survey. Then we look at the item frequencies, percentage of the sample that selected each response option for the 2 surveys. And the standard survey is shown outside of parentheses. Within parentheses, it's the easy survey. So CAPS survey items tend to be skewed in the positive direction. And these are worded, so if you say always, that means that's a positive thing, because we found problems when you tried to switch to the direction of item stems. If we worded it in a negative way, people, got confused with that. So everything, a higher score is better. And this is not atypical in terms of distribution, but the main thing is we're comparing the 2 surveys, and where we see one difference is what's highlighted at the bottom. I'm not sure exactly why, but the easy survey led to more positive assessments of office staff. Everything else looked pretty comparable. So it wasn't much difference in item distributions, except on the office staff, a couple of items where the easy survey respondents were a little more positive. The next is to look at the 4 composites, the means, the standard deviations, and the Cronbach's alpha, internal consistency reliability. And at the bottom of the page, have a quick summary of how you estimate internal consistency reliability using analysis of variance. You're basically separating out between patient variance versus an interaction term between the patient and how they answer items in a multi-item scale. You'd like them to be consistent, so you want the mean squared error or mean squared EMS to be low, and you want that to be low relative to the between patient variance. And another way of thinking about alpha is, are the items in the same scale highly correlated with one another? So when we look at this in the CG survey, you get pretty good internal consistency reliability. It's a little low for coordination. Coordination is often one of the composites in CAPS that isn't as internally consistent as other ones, so that wasn't too surprising. Reliability 0.70 or above is the threshold for research purposes, and 3 of the 4 are above that easily. 0.65 is a bit below. And then if we look at easy, they're all above 0.70. Even the coordination scale has really good internal consistency reliability. But remember, that's where we had the 1 item where it's talking about explanations from the provider, whereas the standard survey just asked about whether they got test results. So that's contributing to the higher reliability on that 1 scale. But overall, they both look like they're producing reliable data for this sample. It's, with the exception of coordination being a little low for CG, but that's typical because the items that assess coordination don't tend to be, they're more heterogeneous in content. So the next thing was correlations among the scales and the global rating of the doctor. And we basically had pretty similar correlations. The CG is presented above the diagonals, EZ is below. One of the things that we often find is that communication by providers has the strongest correlation with the global rating of the provider. And that is the case here with the EZ below. The correlation of communication with the global rating at the very bottom is 0.73. And it turns out coordination was also very highly correlated, 0.77. So that's a little bit different than normal, but that could be because of the one item where Jose decided to get really essentially get a communication with that item. The highlighted ones here are the ones that differ the most between the two surveys. So communication and coordination in the EZ below the diagonal are really highly correlated, 0.82. And if you look at communication coordination for CG, they're also highly correlated, but not as highly correlated, 0.61. And we know from other CAP studies that communication and coordination are highly correlated. They tend to be, but what's going on in EC is even higher than what we typically see. And again, that's because of that one item that was really about communication that Jose put in there. It wasn't as parallel to the original CG survey as the other items were. And then you see the global rating coordination in the EZ survey is also highly related to global rating, more so than it is with the standard CG survey. Again, it's that item that Jose put in about communication that's reflected in coordination that contributes to that high correlation. Overall, though, it's pretty similar associations. Then the next thing we do, it says provider level here correctly. And this is in caps the most important estimate of reliability, because the way we're going to use these things is not for individual patients. We're going to aggregate them up and compare providers or systems of care. So we want provider level reliability more so than even internal consistency reliability. And the difference here is now we're looking at mean squared between providers and how what they're getting in terms of patient reports, and comparing that within provider variance. So it's analogous to what we do with internal consistency reliability, but we don't have the same patients rating all the doctors. Patients are nested within providers, so we have to use a slightly different model to estimate it. But we're focused on how much between variance there is versus how much within variance. We're trying to see if patients are agreeing in what they're saying about the same provider. Well, this is where we get an interesting result with the standard survey. At least in this small sample, the reliability is really terrible for provider level on CG, clinician group survey. I put 0 in there for 3 of those scales, for the timely scale or access scale, communication scale, and with office staff. And essentially, that means that you can't even estimate how many people would need to get a certain level of reliability, like 0.70, which is what we typically want to know. The only 2 scales that you can get an estimate out of are the coordination scale, where it says you would need, it's a very small reliability from the sample, 0.08, and you need 207 patients per provider to get a reliability of 0.70. The global rating item, you get reasonable sample size that would be needed, 31 patients per provider to get a reliability of 0.70. In our sample, we don't have that many patients per provider, so the observed reliability is 0.38, but that's not what we would expect to do in the future. We could get good reliability with a larger sample. But the EZ survey, though, did up much better on this criterion. You can see that the only failure was on office staff, and that's probably understandable, where we got 0 reliability because, office staffs may not differ as much as the other variables where we're looking at more provider-centric kind of constructs. So other than that, if you look in the final column, it says that for a lot of these things, we could get reliable enough data, 0.70, if we had somewhere between like 17 to 21 patients per provider. And that's not unrealistic. And it's consistent with prior work. A lot of prior work said it takes, for a lot of measures, patient experience, it takes about 25 patients per provider to feel comfortable that you're going to get a reliability of 0.70 or higher. Now, with coordination, it's 65 people, so that's that's pretty high. But still, when we compare the new survey with the existing standard, it's doing better clearly on provider level reliability. So this is one win for the new survey. So in terms of analyzing the survey, this is just one thing that you would potentially want to do. And I just did this with the standard survey just for illustration. To go beyond everything that we've done so far, you'd like to look at how well the items are really clustering the way you have assumed they are when they're measuring different things. So we have the 4 constructs with multiple items each, and we look at the item scale correlation with each of those constructs. And when the item is supposedly measuring that construct, like the time the construct has 3 items, I've highlighted that in yellow, and it also has an asterisk, because those correlations are corrected for overlap. So we're getting the correlation of the item with the sum of the other items that are measuring the same thing. And we get really good support for the 4 constructs overall, that they're distinct. We want to see those yellow entries being the highest correlation in the row, which says that item measures that thing more than it is correlated with some related constructs. And that's always a good thing. Now, the one exception, though, is that blue highlighted item, which is one of the hypothesized coordination items on how often did this provider seem to know the important information about their medical history. It correlated 0.82 with communication versus 0.42 with coordination. So even though that's the way that item is set up in the standard survey as a coordination item, it really seems to be more of an indication of communication. And if you look at the item, it makes sense. The provider seems to know the important information. Well, that's a communication issue. So it makes sense that it could go there. In fact, there is a survey that's an offshoot that's based on CAPS where that's exactly what is done. That item goes into communication. So they have a 5-item communication scale. So they don't score that as a separate coordination item. They actually put it in with communication. And that's primary care first patient experience of care survey. So there is some precedent for doing that. Now, another thing you could do that's related to just looking at the correlations of the items with the scales is you could do a factor analysis, and you could just say, well, I want to know, we think there are 4 underlying constructs, but let's pretend like we have no idea. And let's just let some different rules of thumb tell us how many underlying constructs there are. So one of the most common ones people use is to look at principal component eigenvalues, and they look for how many eigenvalues are greater than 1. And when we do this with the observed data here, we find that there are 3 that are greater than 1. Those are highlighted there. So that suggests, well, maybe there are 3 underlying dimensions, not 4. And I did this analysis assuming these are continuous items. When we know that's not the case, over there on the right at the bottom, I also use polychoric correlations, which are more appropriate for categorical data. It assumes there's an underlying continuum that's been chopped up. And whenever you estimate polychoric correlations among your items, you're going to get higher correlations because it's adjusting for the fact that it seems like we've chopped up some continuous data. And when you look at that, it's saying, well, somewhat almost 3. I mean, the third eigenvalue is 0.98, so it's not really above 1, but it's pretty similar result to what we got with, assuming they're continuous. So I'm going to say, well, 3 is close enough for that. Another thing you can do is you can look and see whether the observed eigenvalues, now here we've estimated not principal components, but principal factors, where we allow for our squared multiple correlations as commonality estimates. And you can see the observed eigenvalues under that model, and you can compare them with what you'd expect by chance alone, random eigenvalues. And when we do that, this is another rule of thumb. It's saying no more than 4 factors. So now we've got one that's saying 3 and one that's saying no more than 4. And then another thing you can look at is a scree plot, where you plot the eigenvalues and you try to see where it looks like there's just kind of no slope left. There's kind of a scree, like on a mountain slope with boulders. And so it's a little bit subjective. I also indicate some other rule of thumb here that didn't work out too well, Tucker-Lewis reliability coefficient, but it does suggest that more factors are, of course, going to account for more variation in the data. You'd really like those to be even higher. But it's really tough here. You can say, well, clearly 1 is always bigger. That's what you always find the first factor. But it looks like you're still getting pretty good slope at 2. And then it's a little hard to tell. 3 and 4 are kind of close together. You might say, well, between 4 and 5, it looks like when you get to 5, there's just kind of like a horizontal line. That's the scree. But it's a little bit subjective. But to me, that's say, well, maybe it's 4 factors. And I also did it with polychoric correlations, and it looked pretty similar. So it's a little bit debatable, whether you would say it's 2 and 3 is really the start of the scree here, or whether it's 4. I'm going to go with 4. So this is a little bit subjective. So that would be consistent with what we found. So then I rotate. You could then try to get a correlated solution. So I will do an oblique Promax rotation and look at what are the factor loadings, which are similar to item scale correlations. And when I do a 4-factor solution, I get something like we saw already with that one item about knowing about your medical history, loading on the first factor, which is really a communication factor. So if you map this out, that would be the new variant, the 5-item communication. And then we get all the other things the way we'd expect. So we get timely communication, and we get, we get coordination, and we get office staff. So this sort of supports the structure with the one item moving over, just like it did in the item scale correlation matrix. And you can also see the estimated correlations among the factors. So far we're getting consistent information about that one item maybe being communication and not coordination. And then I did one more 4-factor based on polychoric correlations. And again, that increases the correlation between items. And when I did that, it brought in more items into the overall communication scale or factor. So I'm not sure which one I would go with, but that's even suggesting you may have more items in there than you do, not just one more additional one, but some additional ones beyond that from other scales. Okay. The final thing I did was a categorical, which is the most appropriate factor analysis, but a confirmatory 3-factor model. So this is now saying, okay, if you did try to fit models, well, first of all, I tried to fit a 4-factor model, but I'm not showing that. But the 4-factor model said, which was consistent with where we were to date, said communication and coordination are correlated essentially perfectly, 1.0. So when you do a categorical model, again, things are more highly correlated. It's probably more appropriate. It's actually saying you're not really getting any distinction there. So I went to a 3-factor model, and there you see the communication scale is really communication and what was coordination before. So now if we look at it this way, it looks like, well, maybe we only have 3 dimensions. Maybe coordination is something that is separate. And this model fits the data well. We have some fit indices down there. Okay, so the final thing I'm going to say, this is not something that I did from this analysis, but in a whole other project of seriously ill patients at UCLA, we actually had the 4 standard CAPS communication items and that medical history item that in the standard CAPS survey is considered a coordination item. And we treated them as if they were one scale, and it did support one scale. So this is further support for the idea that knowing about my medical history, just like it is used in one of these surveys already, seems to be a real good indicator of communication. But I also, the reason I want to show this is using IRT. And I haven't shown IRT here because the sample size is really not very big, but we were able to do it in this sample because we had larger sample size. And this is one of the things that IRT would give you that we haven't seen up to this point with this analysis. It's evaluating the response options, and it's saying, okay, we're going to estimate an overall communication score using IRT scoring, which weights the item differently based on their difficulty and how strongly related they are to the overall score, and then looks at what's the probability associated with each response option of picking that response option. And the response options somewhere along the continuum of communication should be most likely to be picked. So these are like Z scores on the x-axis, and communication goes to the right. Bigger score would be better communication by the patient, lower to the left. And you see like those dark lines to the far left, that's the never response. So the never response is most likely to be picked for people who are low on communication. And that's what you want to see, because the whole point is it's an ordered scale. And then you go up to the next option, which is sometimes. And if you look on the explain item on the top left, that looks like it's never most likely to be picked. It should be, it's in the right location there, because it's sort of to the right of the never response, but it's essentially never most likely to be picked. So that sometimes response choice isn't doing you any good for the explain item, but it is working better on the other items. So that it's working overall pretty well. If you look at the other items, it is most likely to be picked and monotonically in the right order. And then if you go to the next option, usually that's in the right order to the right of that sometimes option. And then to the far right is always, and you hope that that's most likely to be picked by people who are highest on communication experience. So that's another thing you can do. You can say, are the response options working? If you saw the explain result for all the items, the one on the top left, then you might say, well, sometimes it's not doing us any good. Maybe we should use different response options or not use that one at all. Or at least in scoring, we would have to collapse it with some other response option, because it's really, and for that particular item, it's not doing what it's supposed to do and doesn't fit the assumed scoring that you do. But overall, this suggests a pretty good item characteristic performance for that scale in that sample. So I'm going to stop there so we have time